Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Look, we all know the story. It's the bedrock of Western civilization. The manger, the star, the wise men, that gentle figure in the white robe looking up at heaven with a halo. But today, we are stripping all of that away. We're peeling back 2,000 years of theology, of tradition, of church dogma to find the actual man named Yeshua. We aren't looking for the icon on the stained glass window. We're looking for the historical figure, a craftsman in a dusty Roman province, a revolutionary preacher, and a man whose life details often completely contradict the Christmas cards you've got stored away somewhere. We are digging into the dirt of the first century to find the human being buried underneath the God.
It's a fascinating distinction to make. It's absolutely the core tension of our deep dive today. We have to separate the Jesus of faith, that's the theological entity, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, from the historical Jesus. And the latter was a mortal man living in a very specific and very chaotic time and place.
Right.
And to find him, we can't just rely on blind faith or church tradition. We have to use scrutinized sources, archaeological context, even the skepticism of non-believers and Roman historians like Tacitus and Josephus. We have to look at this not as believers, but as historians.
So this is effectively a cold case investigation. We're treating the Gospels not just as holy scripture, but as, crime scene evidence that needs to be cross-referenced, questioned, and, occasionally doubted.
Exactly. We're looking for what historians call the criterion of embarrassment. These are details that the writers wouldn't have just invented because they were awkward or difficult to explain, or maybe even damaging to their cause.
Oh.
That's usually where the historical truth is hiding, in the parts they couldn't quite, scrub out.
I love that. If it makes them look bad, it's probably true.
Okay, before we start connecting the red string on our conspiracy board here, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
Now, let's start with the most basic fact on the sheet, the timeline. If you ask anyone when Jesus was born, they'll say year 1 AD. The calendar is literally based on him, but the sources suggest the calendar is broken.
It is broken, yeah.
Yeah.
The monk who calculated the calendar way back in the 6th century, a guy named Dionysius Exiguus, he miscalculated the dates of the Roman emperors.
No way.
Most modern scholars, looking at the wider events described in the Gospels, actually place his birth somewhere between 7 BC and 4 BC.
So just to be clear, Jesus was born before Christ.
That's the fantastic irony of it, yes.
Wow.
And the dating relies very heavily on King Herod the Great. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, they both explicitly state Herod was alive when Jesus was born. But we know from solid Roman records from coinage that Herod died in 4 BC. So for the narrative to hold up at all, Jesus had to be born before that date.
If he was born in 1 AD, the whole story falls apart from the get-go.
The whole thing collapses, yeah.
Okay, so the year is off. What about the day, December 25th? Is there any actual evidence for that, or is that just another rewrite?
There is absolutely no concrete historical evidence for that date. Not in the scriptures, not in contemporary records. In fact, if shepherds were out in the fields at night, as the story claims, well, it likely wasn't winter.
Right. Too cold.
December 25th was probably chosen centuries later to align with existing pagan winter solstice festivals, things like Saturnalia or the birthday of the sun god Sol Invictus. It was just a way to overlay Christianity onto these older traditions to make conversion a bit easier.
That makes sense from a marketing perspective. Keep your party, just change the guest of honor.
A perfect way to put it.
But the detective work gets even messier when we look at where he was born.
Little town of Bethlehem, right? That's the story. Are you telling me that's in doubt too?
Oh, it's highly contested among historians. The thing is, we have two different birth narratives in the Bible, Matthew and Luke, and if you read them side by side, they're actually, they're mutually exclusive.
How so? In Matthew, it seems Mary and Joseph are already living in a house in Bethlehem. Then, to escape Herod's massacre of the innocents, they flee to Egypt.
Right, the flight to Egypt. Very dramatic.
But then you look at Luke. In Luke's version, they live in Nazareth. They only travel to Bethlehem because of a Roman census. And this is where history just crashes into theology. Luke claims this census was called by Quirinius, the governor of Syria. But we have Roman tax records. We know for a fact that the census of Quirinius happened in 6 AD.
Wait, hold on. You just said Herod died in 4 BC.
I did.
So if the census was in 6 AD, there's a 10-year gap. Jesus can't be born during Herod's reign, and during that census, they didn't happen at the same time.
Precisely. It's a historical impossibility. You cannot have both.
So, why? Why do the writers include these conflicting details? If he was just a guy from Nazareth, why go through all these mental gymnastics to get him to Bethlehem?
It's because of what scholars call theological geography. The Old Testament prophecies, specifically one in Micah, stated that the Messiah would come from King David's line and be born in David's city, which was Bethlehem.
Ah, okay.
The historical Jesus, however, is always reliably associated with Nazareth. He's called Jesus of Nazareth, never Jesus of Bethlehem in his adult life.
So they were connecting the dots backwards. They started with the conclusion, he is the Messiah. And since the Messiah must be from Bethlehem, they had to invent a reason to get his parents there, even if the dates didn't line up.
That is the consensus among critical scholars, yes. They were bending the history to fit the prophecy. It's less about recording events and more about proving a theological point. And speaking of family, this brings us to the virgin birth versus the historical family.
This is a sensitive one for believers, I know, but from a purely historical standpoint. The sources mention siblings. Are we talking about like spiritual brothers or something?
That's the traditional defense. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions argue these were cousins or maybe step-siblings from a previous marriage of Joseph's. But if you look at the actual Greek in the earliest sources, in Mark and Matthew, they use the word adelphos.
Which means?
It means a blood brother. And they don't just mention them, they name them. 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude. And they also mention unnamed sisters.
And we have outside corroboration for this, right? It's not just in the Gospels.
Do. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing later in that century, talks about the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. He doesn't say cousin, he says brother.
So, historically speaking, the picture isn't this lonely divine child. It's a man who grew up in a big, crowded, probably poor Jewish household in Nazareth with brothers and sisters running around.
That's the picture, yes. The idea of his divine exclusive birth seems to be a layer added later, as his status was elevated from prophet to son of God in the minds of his followers.
Okay, let's pivot to the sources themselves. I think most people assume the disciples were following him around with notepads, acting like court stenographers. Day 4, miracle. Day 5, sermon. But that's not how these books were written at all, is it?
Not even close. The 4 canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were written between 70 A.D. and about 110 A.D. So that's 40 to 70 years after Jesus died.
That is a massive gap. It's like me writing a biography of someone from the 1950s based only on stories my grandparents told me.
It's a lifetime. And more importantly, the disciples were Aramaic-speaking fishermen from rural Galilee. They were almost certainly illiterate. The Gospels were written in a high-level literary Greek by elite, educated individuals living outside of Palestine.
So not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The traditional names were attached to these anonymous texts much later, in the 2nd century, probably to give them apostolic authority.
So we have anonymous authors writing decades later in a different language based on stories passed down orally. That really does feel like a game of telephone. How much can we actually trust?
Well, in 1985, a group of scholars called the Jesus Seminar convened to analyze this exact problem. They used colored beads to vote on every single saying attributed to Jesus. Red for he definitely said it, black for he definitely didn't.
And the result?
Their conclusion was startling. They found that only about 16% of the beads and 18% of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels were likely authentic to the man himself.
Wow. Less than 20%. So the vast majority of the red letters in the Bible might be later inventions or elaborations by the early church. That's staggering.
It is. But you have to remember their goal. The gospel writers weren't modern historians. They were evangelists. They were trying to persuade, not just document. And they were copying each other.
Which brings us to the Q source. This sounds like something from a spy novel. What is Q?
It stands for Quell, which is just the German word for source. Scholars notice that Matthew and Luke have a ton of material, mostly sayings and sermons. That isn't in Mark. But the wording in Matthew and Luke is often identical.
So they were copying from the same cheat sheet.
Exactly. The theory is that there was a lost collection of sayings, the Q source, that both writers had access to.
And some documents didn't survive because they were deliberately cut, right? The Apocrypha, the stuff that didn't make the final edit.
Yes. Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. Later on, when Christianity became the state religion under Emperor Constantine, there was a big push to standardize the text. So they selected the books that fit the specific theological narrative they wanted to promote.
The Orthodox view.
The Orthodox view, yes. And they discarded or suppressed the ones that were too Gnostic or just plain weird.
So the Bible isn't a raw recording, it's a curated playlist.
That's a perfect analogy. It's a playlist designed to tell a specific story and tracks that didn't fit the vibe were removed.
Okay, let's go back to the man himself, stripping away that editing. What world was he actually living in? Because we sometimes picture this pastoral, peaceful scene. But the history suggests it was more like a war zone.
It was anything but peaceful. First century Judea was a political powder keg. It was under Roman occupation, which meant heavy, crushing taxation. You had these client kings like Herod Antipas, who were basically Roman puppets living in luxury while the peasantry starved. There was this deep, seething resentment.
Sounds like an insurgency just waiting to happen.
It was, and religion was the resistance. You had groups like the Zealots who wanted armed rebellion, literally stabbing Romans in the streets. You had the Essenes who just dropped out of society to wait for the apocalypse in the desert. And into this mix steps John the Baptist.
The wild man in the river.
And the sources suggest Jesus didn't just appear out of nowhere. He likely started as a follower of John. And John's message was pure apocalypse. The axe is at the root of the tree. Judgment is coming.
And Jesus was baptized by him.
Yes, which scholars view as one of the most historically certain events of his life, because it fits that criterion of embarrassment we talked about.
Why is it embarrassing?
Well, if you're the sinless Son of God, why do you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins by a seemingly lesser prophet? The early church would never have made that up. It strongly suggests Jesus began his career as a disciple of John.
But then John gets arrested, and Jesus goes his own way. He heads to Galilee, sets up in Capernaum, and this is where the message starts to get radical. We hear, "Blessed are the poor," and today it sounds nice on a greeting card, but back then, was that dangerous?
Incredibly dangerous. Jesus deliberately avoided the big Romanized cities like Sepphoris. He stayed in the villages. And his message, "The last shall be first," was a direct inversion of the entire social order. In a society based on honor and shame, saying the poor are blessed and the rich are in for it, that's revolutionary.
And he was hanging out with tax collectors and sinners.
Right, and sinners usually meant the poor, the sick, or just anyone who couldn't afford to follow the strict purity laws of the temple. By dining with them, Jesus was making a profound political statement. He was challenging the authority of the temple elites who enforced those social boundaries.
So it wasn't just be nice to each other, it was a social revolution.
It was a direct challenge to the power structure. He was offering a kingdom of God that belonged to the marginalized, not to the wealthy and the pious. And that is a very quick way to make very powerful enemies.
Speaking of making an impression, the miracles. Walking on water, feeding the 5,000. For a historian, what do you do with that? Do you just toss it out as myth?
You have to contextualize it.
Yeah.
In the ancient world, the divide between natural and supernatural as we see it, it just didn't really exist. Miracles weren't seen as impossible. They were seen as signs of authority. And they weren't unique to Jesus. We have records of other figures like Honi the Circle Maker, a Jewish rainmaker from around that time.
Honi the Circle Maker.
He was a respected holy man. The stories say he drew a circle in the dust and refused to move until God sent rain. The point is, people believed certain individuals could channel divine power. What's fascinating is that even Jesus' opponents in the sources don't deny that he did something.
They didn't say, he's faking it.
No. They said, he's doing it with the power of Beelzebub, or he's a magician. They accepted the event happened, they just challenged the source of his power.
So he was clearly seen as a charismatic healer, even if we strip away the supernatural.
Charismatic is the perfect word. In a time of primitive medicine, a faith healer who offered hope and human touch to the unclean lepers, bleeding women, was incredibly powerful.
But did he think he was God? The Son of God? I mean, that's the central claim of Christianity. From a historical perspective, did the man Yeshua go around saying, "I am God"?
That is the million-dollar question. The term Messiah just meant anointed one, which is a political title for a king. Son of God could refer to any righteous man or even the nation of Israel. But more importantly, Son of God was the official title of the Roman emperor.
Oh, that's a direct conflict.
A huge one. Augustus Caesar was the Son of God. For a Jewish peasant to take that title or have it applied to him was treason. Most historians would argue that the literal divinity, the idea that he was God incarnate, was a theological layer added later by the church. The historical Jesus likely saw himself as a prophet of the coming kingdom, maybe God's viceroy on earth, but not necessarily God himself.
Which makes the end of the story so much more political and tragic. He goes to Jerusalem for Passover, and this is the turning point.
Passover in Jerusalem was a tinderbox. The population swelled with pilgrims. Nationalistic fervor was high. The Romans brought in extra troops. Jesus rides in, and then he does the one thing that seals his fate.
The temple tantrum. Flipping the tables.
The cleansing of the temple, yes. We have to understand, the temple wasn't just a church. It was the central bank. It was the seat of political power for the local elite. It held the debt records. By overturning the tables of the money changers, Jesus wasn't just making a religious statement. He was attacking the wallet of the high priests. He was disrupting the whole economic engine of the occupation.
And you don't mess with the money.
You do not.
Yeah.
This moved him from being a rural nuisance to an immediate threat in the eyes of the authorities.
So they arrest him. But the trial narrative in the Gospels is, it's strange. Pontius Pilate is always washing his hands, saying, I find no fault in this man, and the Jewish mob is screaming for his blood. Is that accurate?
Historically, almost certainly not. This is one of the most significant and tragic distortions in history. We know from other Roman sources that Pontius Pilate was a brutal, ruthless governor. He did not hesitate to execute anyone who even hinted at threatening Roman order. He would not have been bullied by a mob.
So why does the Bible make him look so weak? Why shift the blame to the Jews?
Political survival. You have to remember when the Gospels were being written after 70 AD. The Jews had just revolted against Rome, and Rome had crushed them, destroying Jerusalem and the temple. If you are an early Christian trying to spread your new religion in the Roman Empire, you cannot have a story where your leader was executed by Rome for sedition against the emperor.
But that makes you enemies of the state.
You sanitize the story. You shift the blame. You make Pilate a reluctant participant, and you make the Jewish authorities bloodthirsty. It made Christianity more palatable to the Romans, but it had the horrific consequence of fueling 2,000 years of anti-Semitism.
That is heavy. The historical reality is probably much simpler. Pilate saw a troublemaker causing a scene during a volatile festival, signed the order, and didn't think twice about it.
Yes, crucifixion was a specific Roman punishment for insurrection and sedition. It was a public billboard saying, this is what happens when you mess with Rome.
And on the cross, we get that famous line, my God, why have you forsaken me?
A line that is just incredibly human. Now, some theologians argue he was quoting Psalm 22, which starts in despair but ends in triumph. But from a historical perspective, it reads like a cry of genuine shock.
Like he really expected God to intervene at the last second.
If he truly believed he was ushering in the kingdom of God right then and there, and then he found himself dying on a Roman cross with no armies of angels appearing, that cry suggests a man grappling with the failure of his immediate expectation. He died a human death.
But the story didn't end there, of course. The tomb was empty.
And that's where history has to yield to faith. A historian can't prove a resurrection. But what we can say, historically, is that the disciples believed it happened. They had visions. They saw him, Peter, Paul. They were utterly convinced he had risen. And that belief transformed a defeated, scattered movement into an unstoppable missionary force.
It's just incredible to think about. A Jewish craftsman from a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, executed as a state criminal, ends up becoming the center of the state religion of the very empire that killed him.
It's perhaps the greatest irony in all of history. The movement pivoted from convincing Jews to converting Gentiles, and eventually the Roman Empire bowed to the man from Nazareth.
So, after all of this, what does it all mean? We've peeled back the layers. We found a man who wasn't necessarily the serene figure in the stained glass window, but a fiery social critic.
We found a man who challenged the elite, who stood with the outcasts, and who paid the ultimate price for disrupting the status quo.
That's the takeaway for me. You don't really need the supernatural to find the power in his life story.
Exactly. And that leads to a final, provocative thought I'd like to leave you with. If we strip away the miracles, the church dogma, and all the later edits, we're left with a Jewish social revolutionary who challenged the elite. So does the historical Jesus, the man who fought for the poor and terrified the powerful, actually have more to teach us about justice and courage than the divine Jesus of tradition who was so often used to support the very status quo he fought against?
That is something to chew on. Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We'll see you in the next deep dive.